Good evening, everyone. Hi, welcome. My name is Christine Noah, and I work for the development office at the American Repertory Theater, so I just want to take a moment to welcome you this evening, and thank you so much for coming out to this event, and thank you for your generous support of the theater, for coming, seeing shows, and being contributors and supporting in other ways. We really appreciate it. And productions like 1776, which will happen later this season, are only possible through your support. So thank you for being here. Tonight, this is the first event of our 1776 Salon series, so we will have more events later this season. There's some more information on your program about that. And this is called Performing 1776, The Politics and Poetics of the Declaration of Independence. And so our two speakers tonight are Tim McCarthy, who is an award-winning scholar and educator, public servant, and social justice activist who is on faculty at Harvard University. He is also one of our beloved Board of Advisors members at ART, where he directs and hosts the ART of Human Rights and Resistance Mic. And we also have John Stauffer, who is the Cates Professor of English and of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. So without further ado, Tim and John, take it away.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Hello. How are you? This is a very big salon. I'm glad we came here rather than my living room, because about 6 of you would fit there. It's wonderful to be here tonight. It's also wonderful to share the space with my dear friend and colleague, John Stauffer. This is a lecture, pieces of which are part of a course that he and I have been teaching in Harvard College since the spring of 2002. It's called American Protest Literature from Tom Paine. 2000? No, it was conceived in 2000. Oh, Lord. See, we're already disagreeing. There it is. So we've been teaching this since the turn of the century. How's that? And it's a course called American Protest Literature from Tom Paine to Tupac, and it's a course that traces a kind of epic scope of American protest writings and dissent speakings and art and so forth. We define literature very broadly in this course to include songs and visual culture and speeches, as well as printed materials and things we might in some other era traditionally refer to or think of as literature. And this is a course where we look at a range of what we call these radical traditions or protest literature traditions. And we seek to study these from the American Revolution, the period of the American Revolution. We start with Tom Paine and the Declaration of Independence, which is where we'll be focusing our energy today. And we go all the way up to hip-hop culture and globalization and modern-day slavery and a whole range of human wrongs and global injustices that can in some ways trace their roots back through the literatures and histories and politics and culture that we've been looking at in the course. And over the course of the term, and we're going to refer to this today, we think about these works with respect to 3 rhetorical strategies that we outline in the course that we think that all works of protest literature manifest in some ways. And one of those is what we call shock value, which should be obvious to anyone, the ways in which these protest texts shock us into some kind of recognition or outrage or sense of urgency that call us into the urgent work of solving injustice. And so many of these texts are texts that were meant to and designed to shock their various audiences into some kind of action or activism or shift in consciousness. Another rhetorical strategy that these artists and writers and cultural workers are using is what we call empathy, the idea of trying to tell stories and represent the injustices of the world and the struggles of various people in a way that opens up pathways to empathy as opposed to sympathy, feeling for rather than feeling sorry for. Empathy being a more egalitarian rhetorical strategy of trying to get audiences to understand what it might be like to walk in the shoes of the folks who are experiencing the oppression, who are on the downside of discrimination. And then a third rhetorical strategy that we talk about in the course is symbolic action, the ways in which these protest writers and workers are doing work to invite an audience in to offer up a little bit more ambiguous meaning and representation, to try to get an audience to do their own work of analyzing and figuring out a representation so that they choose for themselves how to act in the world as a result of being inspired or moved or shaken in some way by these texts. And so we look at these three rhetorical strategies: shock value, empathy, and symbolic action, and we look at them through a whole wide variety of texts from, as I said, the American Revolution to the very present day. Over the years, John and I have taught now thousands and thousands of students in Harvard College and through the extension school and online and real time. And this has been a labor of love for us. It was first inspired when John and I went to a conference in Harper's Ferry. We were both working on work on abolitionism and slavery at the time, and we went to Harper's Ferry for a bicentennial conference on John Brown's birth. And that was in some ways where this course kind of came to be. We said, we should teach a course together. We should figure out a way to teach this stuff in a way that might be accessible and interesting to undergraduates. And so all these years later, almost 2 decades, here we are. So we're going to give you a little taste of the beginning of that course tonight. We haven't taught the course together in over a year. We're going to be working on a book to turn the course into a book in the coming year, and so this will give you a little taste of that. So here we go. I'm going to speak for a little bit, and then John's going to speak for a little bit. We're going to riff and then open it up. And we always team teach. We always tag team. We have different pieces of our lecture. We try to choreograph it a little bit, and then sometimes we just like riff back and forth, and that's where the fun happens. That's what the students always comment on in the course evaluations about how weird we both are when we tell our corny jokes. So let's begin. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. That, of course, is the beginning of the American Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. Every time I read that, and we always read it at the beginning of the course, and then we reread it because so many of the authors and artists that we study in the course have rewritten the Declaration in various forms, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. It takes on new meaning. And I can't help but think in this moment, not to get too political, that the Declaration speaks to us across the centuries and the grave in new ways. The Declaration of Independence, both the document and the action, was by no means inevitable. That John Adams, one of the drafters of the Declaration of Independence and a famous founding father from this Commonwealth of Massachusetts who went on to become a one-term president, once said that the revolution, the American Revolution, had taken place by the time the Declaration of Independence came into the world in the hearts and minds of the people in the decade and a half prior to the signing by the 13 colonies of this declaration. And let me just give you a sense of where folks were a decade before the Declaration was signed. In 1765, two of the most prominent pamphleteers of the American Revolution were not optimistic about the prospects for independence. James Otis from Massachusetts, educated here at Harvard, was the first to write a pamphlet denouncing the Stamp Act of 1765. And he wrote this about his colonies. Were the colonies left to themselves tomorrow, America would be a mere shambles of blood and confusion. That was James Otis. And then John Dickinson, who was a lawyer from Philadelphia, and his pamphlet, The Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, was the leading pamphlet of the Revolutionary period before Tom Paine's Common Sense, which was published anonymously in January of 1776. And he wrote this: independence would bring, quote, a multitude of commonwealths, crimes, and calamities, centuries of mutual jealousies, hatred, and destruction. Hardly a pretty prophecy in 1765. And yet by the spring of 1776, 11 years later, not 11 years later, the colonies had moved much closer to the precipice of independence and then finally would declare independence from Britain in that spring and early summer. So let me take you back a little bit to explain how we got there. We of course didn't have Gallup polls or public opinion polls. We're drowning, of course, swimming in public opinion data right now. We didn't have that back in the day. But if you had taken a public opinion poll in January of 1776, when Tom Paine's Common Sense first sort of hit the streets, as it were, the public opinion polls would have said that the colonies were in favor of not declaring independence. And yet during this 6-month period, there was a palpable shift. It's hard to document because we don't have a lot of the archives and records, but from what we can discern, based on the records that have been left behind, there was a huge shift in public opinion, even and especially within the political classes that were representing the colonies at the Second Continental Congress, a huge shift in public opinion in favor of independence. But this was hotly contested. It was in some ways the most divisive and most contentious political issue of the day, certainly one of them. On June 7th of 1776, the Virginian Richard Henry Lee entered a resolution to the Second Continental Congress proposing that, quote, these united colonies, and they were hardly united at the time, are, quote, absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that, quote, all political connections between the colonies and Britain are, quote, totally dissolved. That was a resolution that was put into circulation, and ultimately it was voted on in favor of, but not unanimously. New York would be a holdout, actually, of that resolution. And so when the Declaration of Independence talks about unanimity or unanimous, that was actually a fiction that they were writing into existence. Only 12 of the 13 colonies had actually passed Richard Henry Lee's resolution at the end of June. There was an intense 2-day debate that was informed by a shifting landscape of politics in the colonies that these representatives were seeking to represent. In part, as I mentioned, this shift was catalyzed in some ways by the publication of Tom Paine's Common Sense, which, as I said, was published anonymously. It was published in pamphlet form, widely circulated and read aloud by those who were literate to those who were not literate or not yet literate. And Tom Paine's Common Sense, as the title suggests, was a common sense argument against the divine right of kings, against the system of monarchy, and against colonial dependence on the crown and on Britain. And this pamphlet had a huge impact on the way that people were discussing and debating this move for independence, and it had a huge impact on that public opinion shift. But it wasn't the only thing that was happening in the colonies at the time. As Pauline Maier, the late historian at MIT, has written about, she talks about the fact that at the local and colonial levels, not at the Continental Congress level, but at the local grassroots levels, there were more than 90 what she calls other declarations of independence that were debated and passed at the local level that were also spurring this contentious debate about independence. And so by the time you get to the Declaration of Independence, from which I've just read, you had almost 100 other declarations of independence that were circulated in various places across the 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard. And so some of the language that you see in those other declarations of independence percolate up through the leaders and representatives at the Second Continental Congress and then to the Declaration itself. Now this is something that I want to mention, that these declarations, these pamphlets like Tom Paine's Common Sense, were part of a print culture tradition that was flourishing during the period of the Revolution. that during the period of the Revolution, as my late great professor from Harvard College in the early 90s, Bernard Balin, has written, but not late, he's great, he's not late, I should, sorry about that, Bernard Balin, might even be here, and if he is, I apologize. Not late, but certainly still great, late in life, maybe. And Bernard Balin has written about the pamphlet wars of the Revolution and how they created the kind of infrastructure in print of the ideological origins of the American Revolution. And so this culture of print, these cultures of print and broadsides and pamphlets and declarations and other printed materials became in some ways the lubricant for the political discourse and debates and contention of the time. And these debates about independence, about rights, about liberty, even about equality, which we'll get into in a second, were things that were happening in print all the time and being read aloud in town squares and pubs and other places that helped, again, to lubricate that political debate that ultimately led to the Declaration. But not all the colonial assemblies in all of the 13 colonies sent their delegates to the Second Continental Congress to vote on independence. There was still a lot of debate even within the political class of elites that were at that body. And so Congress postponed the vote on the Declaration on the resolution, on Richard Henry Lee's resolution until July, because they knew that they didn't have the unanimous support from the various representatives to pass a unanimous Declaration of Independence. And so, despite that, postponing the vote, they still constituted a drafting committee. They constituted and empowered a drafting committee to produce a document in the event that the delegates would someday come to that kind of unanimity or political certainty that would lead to the Declaration of Independence. And so this drafting committee produced a document that would become the Declaration of Independence. But they were empowered to write a declaration that was written as if independence had already happened. So they were writing a document. They were imagining a world in which the United 13 colonies had come together to pass the resolution. And so the Declaration was written as a fait accompli in the midst of a political debate that was by no means certain. That was something that was still very much aspirational. And yet they wrote it in these ways: humble petitions, repeated injuries and usurpations. The king is a tyrant. They had forfeited their right. He had forfeited his right to be the ruler of a free people. Right? This declaration was written to draw a line in the sand and to produce a break with history. The 5-member committee with Thomas Jefferson, then 33, John Adams, the outspoken, though somewhat more conservative, temperamentally and politically, Massachusetts politician. Robert Livingston, his even more cautious colleague from New York. Roger Sherman, the Connecticut lawyer who later became the architect of representative government at the Constitutional Convention. And then Ben Franklin from Pennsylvania, who was the oldest and most distinguished member of the committee delegation. Jefferson was selected to write the draft of the drafting committee for a number of reasons. He was a lawyer, some of them were, but he was also a gifted writer and an intellectual, and he was widely known as such. He was a little bit of a firebrand and rabble-rouser at times, and he was the only Southerner, as you can see from that quintet. The delegates were aware of the growing tensions that were now percolating between what became, after the Declaration, after the Constitutional Convention, the North and the South, that lead, of course, to the American Civil War, which we'll mention in a little bit. Congress wanted to avoid the perception in the world, or the impression to others, that the American Revolution was being waged by a band of revolutionary and impetuous New Englanders. There were blue states and red states even then. Jefferson, as he often did, produced a draft quickly. He submitted the draft on June 28th. They made revisions both at the level of the drafting committee and then the larger Continental Congress. 300 words were cut from Jefferson's draft. He was pissed off about this. He called them mutilations, and then went on to handwrite copies of his original draft of the Declaration because he was so upset by the mutilations of the document that he wanted to have his draft for posterity. And yet Lee's resolution passed on July 2nd. The Declaration of Independence was adopted on July 4th. Only 12 states on July 2nd approved Lee's resolution. New York was the one holdout. It would take 15 more days, which is why they didn't sign the Declaration of Independence until August, as opposed to July 4th, 1776. So all of the mythology around July 4th, 1776 as being the day of national independence is true, but the unanimous 13 colonies who become the United States of America, that's a fiction. The idea that it was signed on the 4th, which is part of our mythology, it's read on the 4th, but it wasn't signed until August, becomes part of the founding mythology. So much of what we sometimes invest in July 4th as meaning is actually a composite sketch of what was happening over a longer and broader period of time. The Declaration of Independence is important for a million reasons, but let me just list several. First, this is a document that imagined a nation. It was a document that beckoned a new form of representative government that was national in scope. These united colonies are free and independent states. It's imagining a nation that is comprised of parts, but that also beckons a new whole. And it does this in a whole variety of ways. The Declaration of Independence also shifts the power, rhetorically and politically, from a government that is governed by a king, the he of the Declaration of Independence, to a people's government, a we that gives consent to be governed. So it's a shift in power from a he to a we, from a monarchy to an emerging and not yet fully formed democracy. And it shifts the political power, and it does that both at the level of language and at the level of political ideology and later institution building when you get to the Constitution. It articulated powerfully a vision of rights, that government is constituted to protect the natural or inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. During this period of the Revolution, building up to this moment in the Declaration of Independence, and then long afterwards, the rights language was emerging as a big debate. What were rights? What were natural rights? What were the rights of individuals, of peoples, of states, etc.? And so this rights language that the Declaration of Independence articulates very powerfully becomes a very important political discourse that gets inscribed both in the Declaration itself and in subsequent political documents down to our present day. In some ways, the Declaration of Independence is an early progenitor of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so many other articulations of rights that exist in the world subsequent to this, but it was pretty new in the world at this time. It also established dissent as an important force in American politics and in a conception of natural sovereignty. The right of the governed to articulate grievances, 27 of them in the Declaration of Independence enumerated, but also to dissolve ties. The Declaration of Independence says that people have the right to protest, that they have the right to express their grievances, and they have the right, if things become too tyrannical, to dissolve the ties and the bonds that bring them together. And so this is a very, very important moment where the United States literally writes itself into existence by legitimizing an act of civil disobedience of one people over another, of one government over another. The Declaration of Independence is a printed version of an act of civil disobedience that gets legitimized and legitimated and then written into the founding laws of the nation. And so that's one of the reasons why in our course we refer to the Declaration of Independence as one of the founding texts of American protest literature and of the American radical tradition. And just interestingly, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are things that we see as sort of constituting a kind of containing multitudes. That the Declaration of Independence is a document of dissent and the Constitution is a document of consent. And that the two yoke together, although very much in tension with one another. The Declaration is much more radical, Constitution much more conservative, but if you yoke these two documents together, you get the sort of tension and multitudes of American democracy from the very beginning. But you need the first before you can have the second. You need the dissent before you have the consent, the Declaration of Independence before the Constitution of the United States. And we read these things together, dissent and consent, providing the kind of tension that's the fuel and lifeblood of American democracy down to our present day. And then another reason why the Declaration of Independence is so important is that it is a printed document. That it was not common at this time for peoples to print themselves into existence or write themselves into existence. The British common law tradition is a very different kind of tradition. The Declaration of Independence is a printed document. They understood that being on record in print, because of the pamphlet wars that were going on, because of the influence of Tom Paine's Common Sense, because of these other declarations of independence and the ways in which the colonies and then the nation saw printed culture as a way to constitute nationalism, as a way to write yourself into existence and legitimize yourself in the eyes of the world, to express those grievances in public, was part of the point. And so the Declaration of Independence was not just spoken, although it was meant to be read in public, but it is written. Let me say a couple more things, then I'll pass it over to John. There are many influences that helped to inspire the Declaration of Independence, and I've mentioned some of them. But another major influence was John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, published in 1690. And this was an important influence because of its conception and articulation of natural rights. That people are born, men, in the language of the time, were born with natural rights that guarantee human freedom and equality. That these are God-given rights that both precede and supersede all forms of government. So natural rights are God-given rights that precede any kind of governmental structure and supersede any kind of governmental structure. And that all governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, etc. Locke's natural rights philosophy constituted the foundation upon which the new nation was called into being. But there's a crucial revision that Jefferson writes into the Declaration of Independence. In Locke's Second Treatise of Government, he talks about life, liberty, and property as being these natural rights. Jefferson changes it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's a gauzier, but far less specific thing. Property we get. Pursuits of happiness, joyful, but hard to sink your teeth into. But what it does, these pursuits of happiness, is it writes into the Declaration of Independence a kind of aspirational quality, that people aspire to pursuits of happiness, that there is a better day ahead. And that crucial revision from property to pursuits of happiness is something, too, that animates so much of the aspirational energy that we find in so many of these works of protest literature, and we'll reference a few in a second. The final and perhaps most revolutionary significance, as our dear colleague Danielle Allen has written about powerfully in this book, Our Declaration, the most revolutionary, perhaps, achievement of the Declaration of Independence was its articulation of equality as at once a natural state of being, something that is God-given, also a political ideal, something to cherish and protect, and an aspiration, something to be striven for. And so here equality, which is a very new concept in the history of the world, named as and centered in the Declaration of Independence, twinned with liberty or freedom, becomes something that is both natural and political and aspirational. And so it doesn't just precede and supersede government, it is the thing that governments are constituted to protect and guarantee. And so this is a very new articulation of equality, one that's not just about God, but it's about government. And it's about what we owe to each other as citizens who consent to be governed by that government. And there's a world in which that reading of that articulation of equality becomes, for many people in the American protest tradition, the thing that they seize on to both critique the injustices that government enacts over time and also call into being yet another new world and manifestations of a new world that we see in the antebellum period and the Civil War period and the Reconstruction period and in the 20th century struggles for civil rights and women's rights and labor rights and LGBT rights and so forth. That equality claim is not just something we get from God, but something governments owe us as a right that they need to secure and protect, and that they have the job to do that is very, very, very important. These aspirations of liberty and equality articulated as rights, are the cornerstone of Jefferson's pursuits of happiness, and they are powerful engines of the American protest tradition. Now, one last thing I want to mention before I turn it over to John is that there's a curious thing that was in the Declaration of Independence and then it wasn't in the Declaration of Independence. And this is something that the musical 1776 takes up centrally. And it's one of the reasons why I think Diane Paulus asked John and I to help lead off this Salon series. There are 27 grievances, or were 27 grievances in the Declaration of Independence, carefully enumerated, each one starting with he. Even though Parliament was the root of the problem, but the monarch, the king, he becomes the villain. You need a good villain. Every performance needs a good villain, and the King of England was that villain. And so what Jefferson does at the end of the list of grievances, this is the final grievance in the list enumerated in the draft of the Declaration, but he says, he has incited treasonable insurrections of our fellow citizens with the allurements of forfeiture and the confiscation of our property. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the process of in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in the transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of the infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Determined to keep an open market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain the execrable commerce. And that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting these very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people on whom he has obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. This is Jefferson at his rhetorically most robust. And it's also Jefferson in full meltdown mode. This is what psychologists would call projection. Jefferson, the slaveholder, Jefferson, the rapist, Jefferson, the white supremacist, Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, the articulator of that revolutionary notion of equality that I just mentioned, is trying, as the final performance of this long list of grievances, to blame slavery and the slave trade on the king, rather than to assume some responsibility for his own slaveholding, which he loathed and understood as the central contradiction of both his personal life and the political life of the nation. He would later go on, once he and John Adams got around to talking to each other again long after the 1800 election, when they were dying together. They both died hours apart, 50 years to the day of July 4th, 1776 and 1826. And they wrote together, and Jefferson and Adams were both expressing their concerns about what the nation had become, a fractious nation, a politicized, a polarized nation, a nation full of contradictions, where liberty and equality were elusive aspirations still, those pursuits of happiness far in the distance, because we had slavery, and we had Indian removal, and we had the denial of rights to the vast majority of the population of these United States. They understood that what the country had become was nothing like the country they had imagined. And yet Jefferson, in June of 1776, wrote that last grievance to project his own guilt over slavery onto the king, and the drafting committee said, we're getting rid of this. And so they deleted that whole final grievance. So just like in the Constitution, where there are only 3 oblique references to slavery, in the Declaration of Independence, there are no references to slavery. Jefferson couldn't effect his projection of his guilt onto the King of England because the colonists understood what Samuel Johnson said. Why were they susceptible to the fact that they are talking about freedom and equality at the same time that 1/5 of the population of these United Colony States are slaves or enslaved people? And so they get rid of that final grievance. They erase any mention of slavery from this. Jefferson doesn't get to project his stuff. And so we have a declaration that projects this grand revolutionary vision of independence and rights and liberty and equality in the world with an erasure of any mention of slavery or enslaved people. Because they understood, as Samuel Johnson said, why do we hear the loudest yelps of liberty from the drivers of Negroes? They were susceptible to this, as they should have been. And yet they erased that mention. They punted the contradiction and left it for other ages to resolve.
I'd like to talk about the significance of the Declaration of Independence as a work of literature and why that matters. Traditionally, one of the broad definitions of literature is that it's a text that has aesthetic value. It has, in words, it has music. There's a musicality to it, and it transcends its historical moment. So literature, regardless of when it is published or first circulated, continues to resonate with people through the ages and through the centuries. And that's one of the effects of the Declaration of Independence. It's always transcended its historical moment. In fact, we'll end by pointing out that in the 20th and 21st century, there are over 100 countries that very self-consciously borrowed, in some cases just used this almost the same language, but in a foreign language, of the Declaration to create their own new nation. So it transcends its historical moment, and it has also revolutionized people from 1776 to the present. The only period in which the Declaration of Independence, in a sense, did not circulate as great literature, was not invoked, was the period immediately following the Revolutionary War from 1781 to around 1820. And the reason why is that leaders, and you should understand the revolution is essentially it's like the heads of the Chamber of Commerce or the limousine liberals stage a revolution and want to continue gaining control. All except for Tom Paine, who was a true small d Democrat revolutionary. These were all elites. They were already at the heads. They wanted to shift the form of government, but retain control. And so, understandably, after they succeeded in declaring independence, they didn't want the poor and the blacks and Indians acting on this really powerful document. So they suppressed it. They understood its power. They feared it would lead to continual revolutions, particularly the kind they didn't want. And then after they died, it started to circulate widely. One of the things that when you read, and I'm going to read part of it the way that Jefferson did, is when you read the Declaration as literature, what strikes you as its rhetorical power. And rhetoric is a central aspect of literature going back to classical antiquity, and that it not only in the Declaration employs what Tim mentioned are three defining aspects of protest literature: empathy, shock value, and it's symbolic. The symbolism is important because it prevents the Declaration or any text from being what I call agitprop or an advertisement. In other words, it encourages the reader, the viewer, to spend time with it. And the more time, and to have questions about it. And the more time you spend with it, the more questions you have, the more it's going to affect you and possibly transform you. Where traditionally one of the definitions of an advertisement is you get the message, immediately you walk away, and next day you've forgotten it. Traditionally, going back to Aristotle, one function of literature has been rhetorical. It's this persuasive aspect of communication. In a wonderful book by the scholar Jay Fliegelman at Stanford called Declaring Independence, he describes how rhetoric is transformed in the 18th century at the time the Declaration is written. America and Europe were both revolutionized by an intensified quest to discover a new language, a language that was spoken that could complement natural law. And Tim pointed out the circulation, the rise of natural law. The laws of nature, the rights or values inherent in human nature, universal to all people and to all societies. And this universality of natural law stemmed from the human capacity for reason. That was particularly true in France. In the U.S. And in England, it was more from God. And especially the idea that God endowed all people, all humans, with the power of imagination, and that's what distinguished them from all other animals. And with that, one could become closer to God or divinity. In the antebellum period, the natural law was typically characterized, in fact, as God's law. And in societies where sovereignty was seen to reside in the will of the people, language that captivated the people was understood as a currency of power. One of the reasons why Tom Paine's pamphlet was so amazingly popular to this day, on a percentage scale, Common Sense is the best-selling and most pervasively circulated document, written text in American history. Which had a profound effect on convincing people to declare independence before common sense. A minority of a small, comparatively small minority of people, best that we know by, according to scholars, embraced the idea of independence. Most of them just wanted compromises with England. So this rhetorical power depended upon certain freedoms of speech. And it was also fortunate that really from the Revolution to the 1860, the United States, especially in the northern colonies, in fact, particularly in the northern colonies and then the states, enjoyed greater freedoms of speech, petition, debate, civil liberties than any other country in Europe. And in fact, there was a wide circulation of what I'd now call pornography, both in photography when it was created and in other texts that was allowed to circulate.
Now.
Another example is Balzac was first translated into English in the United States rather than England, in which his publisher knew that the British were more interested in Balzac because the British considered Balzac too tawdry, they didn't want it circulating. The Declaration of Independence, another aspect of the musicality of its rhetorical power, is that it was very important for the founders that it was first heard and not read. Jefferson was asked by Adams, I'm simplifying the story, to draft the Declaration because in part Adams considered Jefferson the best writer among the founders. He was the head of the committee to create the document. Jefferson himself was a fairly deep student of rhetoric, the art of persuasion. He had written an essay, in fact, called Thoughts on Prosody, and in it Jefferson likened great literature to music. He understood the aesthetic power of literature. In fact, he said, in any rhythmical composition, the ear is pleased to find at regular intervals a pause where it may rest, much as a piece of music is divided into bars. For Jefferson, great literature aspired to the condition of music. In many respects, he anticipated the famous aesthetic maxim of Walter Pater, who was the philosopher of art theorist. He was considered the patron saint of aestheticism, a very popular aesthetic and art movement in literature and the arts and in architecture in the late 19th, early 20th century, in which Walter Pater famously said, all art constantly aspires toward the condition of music. Jefferson, however, was a horrible public speaker. And because he was charged with writing, he also was the first to deliver it.
He gave 2 speeches while president.
Yes. He was truly a horrible public speaker. He was very nervous, so nervous, in fact, that in the draft that he would read, for him to capture the cadence, he created what he called pause marks. So it would tell him when to pause. They look like quotation marks. And this first draft that actually circulated as the official broadside of the Declaration, it was hastily printed for wide distribution. It's set from Jefferson's draft, not knowing that Jefferson creates these quotation marks. You can see it like we hold these truths to be self-evident. Quotation mark. It's like, what the heck is that quotation mark? Well, it's Jefferson telling himself, I got to pause here. And after they recognized their mistake, they suppressed that and they printed the actual first draft. I want to read to you the Declaration and try to read it as Jefferson imagined reading it or wanted to read it, paying attention to the pause marks, because the pause marks for Jefferson highlighted certain things that he wanted, he hoped his document, his work of art would emphasize. So here's my stab at reading the Declaration in the way that it was first delivered with his pauses. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Now, reading this opening one-sentence paragraph of the Declaration with Jefferson pause marks emphasizes a few things. One is the dissolving of political bands. Another is the separate and equal station of the powers of earth. We want to be a new nation, separate and equal to Britain, other nations. And I'm going to dwell on this passage for a while, and the fact that, and a lot of people have scratched their heads over this, and the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle the colonists to a separate and equal station among the powers of earth. So laws of nature and of nature's God. I've already suggested the laws of nature is the natural rights. It goes back to William Blackstone's. It's natural law stemming from God's law. In fact, Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England is 4 volumes, first published in 1765. Those 4 volumes are one of the most important texts in America, in the United States, from the late 18th century through the 19th century. But the nature's God suggests that Jefferson was a prophet. And the founders were prophets. What is prophecy? It's the belief that you're acting out what you perceive to be God's will. And on the one hand, this is ironic because Jefferson and most of the other founders called themselves deists. But on the other hand, in terms of this work of literature, of music, why would he go to the lengths to say the laws of nature and nature's God? He clearly means 2 different things. Yeah. A number of scholars, including myself, have suggested that they want there to be a prophetic power because it gives it greater force. And in American protest literature, prophecy is one of a common theme because of the empowering nature, especially for individuals who have no power. If I'm poor and I have nothing, or I'm a slave and I'm acting on what I perceive God's will, it liberates me from certain constraints. It means that even if there's a lot of destruction and death along the way, I don't have to worry about it because I'm simply acting out God's will. And I should add that the Bible was probably the most widely read book in the late colonial period and certainly in the 19th century. So the Declaration can be seen as not just a sacred text, almost in a secular way, but a prophetic text. Tom Paine's common sense was similar. Paine appeals in common sense. In fact, common sense makes possible the Declaration of Independence because of its influence. Paine was raised a Quaker, and one of the definitions of a Quaker is that you believe that the Christ or God or the divinity is within you and within every human being, which is why Quakers were pacifists, because to do violence against human beings is to do violence against God. Paine appeals to the divine law, the Word of God, to bring forth a new charter of America. The problem of prophecy is that how do you distinguish God's will from individual will? And it's similar to Jefferson's invocation of the Republican we. I mean, the society that these heads of the Chamber of Commerce, so to speak, founded. It was known as a Republican society. So it was a society in which people embraced a common good. There was a clear natural hierarchy. There were leaders at the top, but everyone knew one's place. Ambition was seen as the bane of Republican society because to compete with people above you, that's going to lead to anarchy and chaos. But it was the responsibility of the leaders to provide for and to protect the lower orders, the people at the low end of the hierarchy. That's essentially an understanding of republicanism and how Jefferson, although not Tom Paine, recognized this. And the Republican we captured this sense that Jefferson can use we, and he thinks that, he's imagining that his slaves and the very poor people are going to be part of that we. Let me return to the Declaration, the opening paragraph. Or let me elaborate on it. Years later, when Jefferson looked back on the Declaration and the Revolution, he insisted that the document he authored was not an expression of his mind, but of what he called an expression of the American mind. He essentially said, I didn't write this document, the Americans collectively did. I channeled them.
Which is in contrast to his mutilation comment earlier. America mutilated my work.
Yes. He envisioned himself as the true good Republican. And later, activists and radicals who would, on the one hand, embrace the power and the aspirations of the Declaration would repudiate that Republican we and want to use I. Would quote the Declaration, but make it clear that there's an I and a you and that we are different. For Jefferson and almost every other founder, equality, as I said, did not imply equality of opportunity or social equality. It was more that all humans are children of God. In that way, we are equal. Another aspect of the prophetic nature of the Declaration is in its ending. After a laundry list of grievances against King George, which functions as a kind of shock value, the last paragraph relies again on God for its rhetorical power. Now, I should say this prophetic interpretation is not universal. There's debate on it. And it's ironic, well, I'll go into that later. The last paragraph. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So it ends with an appeal to God, a reliance on God. Earlier, it's been made clear that God has entitled the colonists to separate and to form a new nation. The document is, in that sense, a sacred text. Now, and the kind of sacredness of this text, it reaches its apogee really much later because of the fact that the founders, as I said, were deists, meaning that they imagine God as far away rather than immanent or indwelling, able to affect the affairs of the world right now. No, it's incumbent upon humans. And let me give to you, first let me show you, here's the actual declaration, the first printing of it without Jefferson's pause marks, which was then widely circulated. And the influence of the Declaration of Independence arguably began before it was even published in the form of a protest, an appeal from the wife of John Adams, Abigail Adams. It's a photo or a painting of John and Abigail, Gilbert Stuart of John Adams, Benjamin Blythe of Abigail Adams. And 3 months before the Declaration of Independence is circulated, Abigail writes to John. They're in different cities. They're in constant, almost daily communication by letter. Abigail is, in my view, a better writer than John Adams.
She was a better person, too.
She is a better person.
If I were to bring one of them back for a dinner party, it would not be John.
So they're constant. It's political, but it's also beautiful. And Abigail says in this letter of March 31st, 1776, I have sometime been ready to think that the passion for liberty cannot be equally strong in the breasts of those who have been accustomed to deprive their fellow creatures of theirs. Of this I am certain, that it is not founded upon that generous and Christian principle of doing to others as we would that others should do unto us. The golden rule, a foundational aspect of empathy. It's in virtually every major religion. I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and we will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation.
Right.
That's Abigail. John's reply.
This was before the Declaration of Independence.
3 months before.
Yeah.
As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians, people like Adams himself, and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe more numerous and powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented. This is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are so saucy.
Saucy.
I want blotted out. Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know they are little more than theory. Those letters become especially, they circulate and become especially popular beginning in the antebellum era, actually through the 20th century.
If you haven't read them, they're anthologized. They're absolutely spectacular. Yeah. It's quite a lens into a marriage of that time.
Yeah, it really is. In fact, they're at Massachusetts Historical Society.
Yeah.
It's 20 minutes from here. You can actually see that.
You can
hold that actual letter. Yeah. It's worth the trip. Here's another, in effect, or document that was inspired by the Declaration of Independence. This is the Vermont Constitution, 1777. Why do I include an image of this Vermont Constitution? It's not a particularly interesting image, because this is the first constitution in world history that in the very Constitution calls for the abolition of slaves in the state, inspired by the Declaration of Independence. Another inspiration is that Belinda Royal, a slave in Boston, a slave of Isaac Royal, who became a loyalist and left for Nova Scotia, abandoning his slaves. Belinda was 63 years old, and in 1783, acting on these ideals of the Declaration of Independence, petitioned the General Court of Massachusetts. And I should say that petitions have also functioned as an immensely powerful protest document. From classical antiquity, there's a long tradition of a government being willing to at least read and acknowledge a petition, no matter how poor or disfranchised you are, that a petition was like a prayer to God. God will at least listen to your prayer, even though God won't heed your prayer. And Belinda petitioned through a lawyer for her freedom and reparations. She demanded reparations for all the labor that she did. Her master just leaves her high and dry with no food, no shelter, no clothing. And she's granted a pension of 15 pounds and 12 shillings to be paid out of the estate of Isaac Royal. So it's a successful petition. And one of the reasons I mentioned this, and it's based on her being inspired in part by the Declaration, and certainly greatly inspired her lawyer, is that, as you all know, reparations is one of the debates that we're having today. And I would say a large percentage of people who oppose reparations say, it's un-American. Americans don't offer reparations. That's like France, socialistic. Yet there is a long tradition of reparations as it relates to slavery in particular.
Both the granting of reparations,
yes,
and the appeals, the demands
exactly
of reparations. Right. Both of them, long-standing traditions.
Yes. In the wake of the Declaration, it fuels the rise of the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic abolition movement. And one of the first effort to try to end slavery is that both Americans and British work together, and they believe, and in England it's accurate, that if they can end the slave trade, then that becomes a kind of promissory note for the eventual end of slavery, because England in They're making money hand over fist in their colonies in the New World and the British West Indies. But slaves died out, essentially. The deaths exceeded the births. So if you cut off the supply, that will lead to an eventual end of slavery. And one of the targets that they used was to appropriate the architectural drawings of a slave ship. And this is an architectural drawing designed for shipbuilders to build a ship so it will both hold the maximum number of slaves, but supposedly provide them a degree of humanity so not that many people will be killed. And so this is a drawing that is circulated to architects and slave owners to build ships that are by code, so to speak. Anti-slavery activists, abolitionists appropriate that. And all of the text, you can't read it, but the text is pointing out the inhumanity of this very ship that's designed to so regulate that trade. And it was very effective.
Well, I wanted to pause one thing. Yeah. John mentioned that there was, within early transatlantic abolitionist thought, the idea or the belief or the aspiration that if the slave trade was abolished, that slavery itself would die. And that was decidedly not the case within the United States. In 1808, which is the constitutional abolition of the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, the transportation or trafficking of persons into the United States, there were 1.5 million enslaved people in the United States. 1.5 million in 1808. By the start of the Civil War in 1861, there were 4 million enslaved people, all of African descent. And so there was almost a tripling of the number of enslaved people within the United States after the abolition of the slave trade by constitutional decree in the United States. So there was an internal slave trade that accelerated, and practices of breeding and all sorts of other ways of increasing the population of enslaved people. So that logic that was part of a transatlantic abolitionist imagination did not play itself out. In fact, the opposite played itself out within the United States.
In fact, the United States U.S. South was what scholars have called a slave society rather than a society of slaves, in that you could only understand the culture and the society through slavery. Slavery affected and was foundational to every aspect of life, not just economics. Mm-hmm. And there are only 5 slave societies that all scholars agree on in world history: classical Greece, classical Rome, Brazil, the Caribbean, and the U.S. South. Yeah. And the U.S. South it's the only slave society in which slaves had a net natural growth. It's because of the form of labor. Sugar will kill you in 10 years. Producing and cultivating sugar because of the tropics, because of the danger of actually cultivating it into sugar and cane and rum. Whereas tobacco and cotton, the 2 major sources of labor for slaves in the United States, were backbreaking, but they didn't kill you. And the other way in which slavery in the U.S. as a slave society is unique in these 5 slave societies in world history is only in the U.S. is slavery becomes almost solely defined by race. Not true in the other slave societies.
And we should mention one other thing. At the signing of the Declaration of Independence, all 13 colonies at the moment of independence had slavery in them. Yes. All 13 colonies. So you see Vermont in 1777, in part inspired by the Declaration of Independence, writes in anti-slavery provision into its constitution. They're the first state to do this. Yes. But at the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, all 13 colonies had slavery in it. Some of them were slave societies, right. Virginia, South Carolina, etc. Georgia. Some were on their way to abolishing slavery, so they had different percentages and demographic dynamics and so forth. But it's worth noting that at this moment, which is why that erasure of any mention of slavery from the draft to the final document is so important and telling, because it speaks to a larger dynamic of contradiction that existed at the time.
I mean, John Adams was actually responsible for writing in the Massachusetts Constitution that led to the end of slavery in Massachusetts because it prompted two slaves, Cork Walker and Mumbet, to sue for their liberty based on this new constitution of the state. Both were successful, and the precedent essentially created an end of slavery in Massachusetts. This is one of the most famous paintings relating to the Declaration by John Trumbull. It's huge. It's 12 feet by 18 feet. It's in the rotunda of the United States Capitol. It's actually a fictive image. Members didn't sign it in Congress. The signing was delayed until August of 1776, in part to avoid accountability for treason. But Trumbull and other founders whom he consulted on ignored this fact. He creates a stage-like setting. And the stage-like setting, he wants it to be anchored or set into an aesthetic and art context. It's like a play. But it's also history. It's a work of literature. The Declaration is performed, much as it was performed by Jefferson when he first read it. Trumbull features Jefferson, Franklin, Adams, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, all standing before the desk of John Hancock with other delegates forming a semicircular formation around the assembly. Now, congressmen were outraged at the time by the painting, most of them were, because they felt that nothing could do justice to this sacred document and the event. It was almost a kind of heresy.
And keep in mind this image as we build up to the revival of 1776 this spring at the ART. Keep in mind this image when you see the musical on stage. I'm just going to put that out there for you all to put in your noggins.
For African Americans, the Declaration was hugely inspirational and important. Nat Turner, who led the largest slave revolt in American history, almost successful in one sense. And in fact, his revolt was so horrifying to Virginia that Virginia legislature considered abolition in the immediate wake of Nat Turner's rebellion.
Briefly,
unfortunately briefly. But Turner planned his slave rebellion on July 4th. Didn't happen July 4th because he got sick. Walt Whitman publishes his Leaves of Grass on July 4th, 1855. Thoreau goes to Walden on July 4th. The number of writers in particular who wrote these canonical texts, either publishing on July 4th or being inspired because of something they decide to do on July 4th, there's a long list. But Whitman and Thoreau are two of the most prominent. David Walker, this is his appeal. It's not as well known as it should be, but the best way to understand David Walker's appeal that circulates, he's a Bostonian black abolitionist. He's advocating equality as well as freedom and a true small d democratic society of racial equality for everyone, full suffrage. And his appeal has widely been seen as the first articulation of black nationalism. And black nationalism is understood. A lot of people see black nationalism as a kind of separatist movement, but it's not. For Walker, black nationalism is that whites needed to accept and respect blacks on their own terms. And it was his appeal is essentially appealing to the colored citizens of the world, especially the slaves, but a keynote is that the importance of self-respect and dignity and pride, and manifesting those three cardinal principles in your speech, in your rhetoric, in your writing, and that can become a revolutionary rhetorical form for achieving emancipation and equal rights.
One of the other things we'll mention about the appeal, it says Walker's appeal in 4 articles with a preamble. You'll notice what it says on the title page. We teach David Walker's appeal in our protest literature course. And every year it's one of the documents that most of the students have never heard of, and then it's one of their favorite documents at the end of the term. This is written formally as a document, a pamphlet with a preamble and 4 articles, modeled, ironically, on the Constitution of the United States. And yet it's suffused with the radical, small d democratic, egalitarian ethos of the Declaration of Independence. And there's a moment, an extended moment in the appeal where David Walker takes on Jefferson, where he takes on Jefferson and calls him out as a white supremacist and a racist and all these things. And it's almost as if he's staging or performing a rhetorical debate with Jefferson, who has just died. So when I have fantasies about being a playwright, I think about what it would be like to actually have a play where John Adams and David Walker came together on stage and actually had that debate across the grave. Because David Walker survives him. He's a preacher, he's a prophetic minister, he's also someone who is a radical black abolitionist and black nationalist in Boston, and he just goes at, it's one of the most eviscerating critiques of a person by another person I've ever read. But one of the things about the appeal that's interesting, and it relates to Nat Turner, is that David Walker, who lived for a time in Boston before his mysterious death, not quite sure exactly what happened to him, although this pamphlet probably had something to do with it, he worked and worked at a slop shop, a used clothing store by the wharves. And one of the things that we know that he did, thanks to the scholarship of a number of folks that we know, is that he would sew copies of Walker's appeal into the lining of jackets. And then he would crate them and he would give them to the black ship hands that would come in on the boats that were sailing to southern ports. And then instruct them to give these crates to black folks in the ports, in the southern ports, down below the Mason-Dixon line. And there's some circumstantial evidence that several scholars have found that Nat Turner, who was literate, actually had a copy of David Walker's appeal, and that David Walker's appeal was, in many ways, one of the inspirations, in addition to other things, for Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia in 1831. So there's all this very interesting sort of connective tissue, but I love the idea of him sewing this pamphlet into the liner of jackets.
Here's Nat Turner's, his As Told to Confessions, which was published and circulated by an attorney that became essentially a best-selling pamphlet. And that's where we know how and why he stages his plans his rebellion for July 4th. And it's nothing if not a religious and prophetic text as well. He is acting literally out of God's will and essentially sees his rebellion as bringing about a new age, a new dispensation, a millennium that would be defined in national terms, in American terms. Seneca Falls Convention was hugely inspired by the Declaration of Independence. In fact, the very title, Declaration of Sentiments. They literally rewrite the Declaration of Independence, in which they invoke women. All men and women are created equal, and want that to be rewritten.
And the he is no longer the king, the he is the tyrannical husband.
This is Frederick Douglass, a photograph of Douglass, a daguerreotype in 1852, the same year that he writes one of his greatest speeches. Douglass was considered one of, if not the greatest orators in the 19th century during that golden age of oratory. In fact, he made more money, he was paid more for his speeches than any other American, white or black, more than Emerson, more than the leading whites. And one of the reasons I show this image is that it, in many respects, echoes the keynote of his What to the Slave is the 4th of July, which he demands citizenship and equal rights. And Douglass always stares directly into the camera lens as though he's staring down the viewer, particularly white viewers, and most whites believe that someone like Douglass should not be accorded the rights of citizenship. He always dresses immaculately. Even his enemies considered him handsome and well-dressed. In many respects, this photograph and his speeches, the brilliance of his oratory, is that he out-citizens white citizens at a time in which most blacks were denied citizenship. And so he is taking at face value the ideals of the Declaration. Sojourner Truth does it as well. Among oratory, and during this golden age of oratory, there was a prejudice against women. It was much harder for women to become public speakers. The one exception was the abolition movement. Sojourner Truth was an immensely effective and powerful orator. And the reason I show you this is that much like this photograph of Douglass, he becomes the public face of America. Douglass is the most photographed American in the 19th century. More separate photographs of Frederick Douglass than of any other figure, white or black. Lincoln, Grant, anyone. I did a book with Zoe Trott and a friend. We documented this. Sojourner Truth is also a kind of public face of America. And here, her motto is, I sell the shadow, meaning the photograph. And there was a spiritual aspect that people endowed in the United States to a photograph to support the substance of my abolition work, of my work for equality. And she presents herself as a successful middle-class person. She is a knitter. She has a book in her hand. It's a middle-class image with a vase and flowers on it. She is sewing. She has a knitting needle. But look closely at the yarn. The yarn actually makes a contour of the United States. You have Maine up top, Florida, and Texas.
The eastern seaboard of the United States. Unfinished.
And unfinished,
or unraveling.
Which is her way of saying that she is an emblem of the United States. She is a representative American person. My own favorite 20th century, and the imagery that inspired by the Declaration continues to this day. In fact, arguably Carl Walker, if you've been to the Fogg Museum, it was just taken down, USA Idioms, which is up for a couple years. Vast. I was thinking of including it, but actually to talk about it would take me a half hour because it's immensely complex. But Carl Walker, a lot of her art has also been inspired by the Declaration of Independence. She's a contemporary artist. This is from Jacob Lawrence, and the struggle it's a series in which he created 30 paintings, 30 images, and he revisits the American past to show in his paintings that America is essentially a protest nation. For Lawrence, his paintings, mostly tempera, he highlights the degree to which struggle and protest represent the central trope of America. And for Lawrence, the history of the United States was a history of protest and struggle. Hence the title of his series, which is a pictorial history. He reveals the power and the contradictions of the revolution through abstract modernist techniques. He abstracts his images, he flattens planes, he highlights individual subjectivity, and through that abstraction, he encourages us to enter into the painting and to become emotionally more connected with it. Focuses on individual details, refers obliquely to historical events. It was based on this Boston Massacre was based on the famous image by Paul Revere that circulated at the time, and Lawrence rewrites it with Crispus Attucks
at the center.
At the center, the first African-American victim of, in a sense, the revolutionary conflict. Well, I'll end by just saying one of my favorite quotes about the power of the Declaration is from Frederick Douglass. I confess I've probably written more on Douglass than anyone else, but in a speech where he talks about the importance of rhetoric, the importance of art in general, he captures the aspirational power of any work of literature, in which he says, poets, prophets, and reformers are all picture makers. And this ability is the secret of their power. They see what ought to be in the reflection of what is, and endeavor to remove the contradiction. That's what the Declaration continues to do. Thank you.
Good. All right, we'll take some questions. Do you have the?
And Emily too.
Okay, we're over here. So raise your hand and bring a mic, and whoever gets there first. And if you just identify yourself and then ask in a form of a question.
My name is David Johnson. You mentioned that in June of 1776, only 12 states voted in favor of the resolution for independence, holdout being New York. Could you comment on what were the New York delegation's reasonings for opposing that resolution?
Yeah, so it was voted on July 2nd, I believe it was voted on. It took a while, late June, early July, and New York was the holdout. I mean, there were many reasons for New York being the holdout. The principal one, in my opinion, was that New York City, and also other parts of New York, but New York City was a major global economic port, and New York had the highest percentage of enslaved people and the deepest connection to the international slave trade and the markets for goods that were made by enslaved people of any what would become northern states. So New York was deeply embedded in that, and so there were, and also in an international economic relationship with Britain and other European powers. And so there were economic reasons and also political reasons. The representatives, many of them of New York, were more temperamentally and ideologically conservative than some of the other, certainly the New England delegates that were much more firebrands, including Adams, who was temperamentally more conservative, but had a lot of, he was anti-slavery and other kinds of things. But that's a short version of why New York was slow to the game. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
My name is Martha Weinberg. Just getting back to the beginning of your talk, when you talked about protest literature and protest writings as shock, empathy, and symbolic action, conveying all of those. Mm-hmm. What is the relevant protest literature of our time?
Right now?
Right now.
That's a great question. It's a great question. I think there are some journalists who are immensely, their essays are works of art and literature, and they have also functioned as works of protest. So that would be one example. Tim and I also, we end our course talking about music, and hip hop has also, it's harder to document, where it's much easier to be able to actually run the numbers and see the influence of an essay that's circulated now on social media and see the impact and how it can affect people. It's harder with music, but those are two genres that have been particularly effective. I would say, partly it's a function. It hasn't happened right now, but I think it has in the past, that photography has always been an immensely powerful form of protest. So in the course we highlight how Vietnam, the Americans ended the war in Vietnam. They withdrew from Vietnam. Even diplomatic historians would say because of the 4 iconic images that highlighted the degree to which war is about killing people. And it brought the war home. In fact, the very term, the living room war, was coined during the Vietnam era. And these images were profoundly influential. Unfortunately, in the wake of Vietnam, both with the Gulf War and with the Iraq War, and today, the State Department has vigorously suppressed the circulation of images that capture what war it does and what war is. The one exception is the Syrian boy Colley, who was, most of you probably remember it, it circulated on social media. It's one of the refugees who was found on the beach, a 4 to 6 year old boy who was dead. That, and the circulation of that photograph prompted immense transformation in Europe and the United States. Chancellor Merkel in Germany, in large part, she acknowledged because of that image, agreed to accept up to 1 million Syrian refugees. And President Obama, despite huge protest, agreed to accept a couple 100,000. That would be another example of recent.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are individual artists, people like Kendrick Lamar. I think Beyonce on a good day.
Beyonce
Lemonade is a protest album. I think there are some really great musicians. There's some old musicians that are still doing work. I saw Joan Baez out there doing her thing the other day. I mean, there's still some folks out there doing things. Tupac still speaks to us from the grave.
That's right.
I think John and I, as we said in our course, take a really broad definition of literature. And so, documentary films, right? There's some amazing documentary film work. Vice and Axios and some of these documentary film organizations are doing really remarkable work. I think at their best, memes and things on social media, I think Twitter at its best serves a protest function, right? As a new medium, a new technology, but also a new cultural phenomenon. And it also has its problems too, but we won't, he who not be named. But I think these kinds of cultural forms are also locations for protest and dissent, democratic insurgency, and certainly a lot of contestation. So I think there's a lot of stuff that's happening right now in that way. And I think theater is. I think theater at its best.
Very much so.
When I think about the Black Clown, the Black Clown started, we were at the first roundtable that helped to develop the Black Clown. It started with Langston Hughes' poem, right? Langston Hughes' poem that was an epic poem that went from slavery to freedom, right? About a clown who becomes a man. That poem, which is 2 pages, has all sorts of liner notes to produce the music in multiple genres that then produce this, I thought, was a theatrical miracle, what Devon Tynes and Michael Schachter and so many other folks produced in that with the choreography and the music and the performance and so forth. I think Jagged Little Pill is a form of protest art in its own way, in ways that it's dealing with the kind of mess of internalized depression and substance abuse and sexual assault and LGBTQ issues and transracial adoption. There's so many things that are going on in Jagged Little Pill that speak to the violences and inequalities of our time, right? I think 1776, the way that I have, heard about its imagining on this stage that we're going to see in the spring is going to have a protest dimension. Yeah. Gloria Life, you look at the air, I'm not I'm on the board of the ART, so I got to say a little bit of that, but I really mean that, right? I think that some works of theater can do that. The Slave Play, right?
Hamilton
has Hamilton has some non-protesty things in it
but
too. That's a longer story, but yeah. I think, but theater can do that work too.
Yeah.
Right. When I think about, when I think about, I'm still alive because of Angels in America. I went to Angels in America, which we also teach in our protest literature class. And we teach this class. I got a student discounted ticket my first year of graduate school at Columbia in the fall of 1993 when that debuted at the Walter Kerr Theater. And I wasn't yet out. And I was starting a PhD program. I was fresh out of Harvard College, and I was depressed because I knew I was in the closet in the middle of the AIDS crisis, and I was not brave enough to join ACT UP. And I went to see Angels in America, and I sat in that theater, and I wept with a whole bunch of people that had survived and that were still trying to figure out how to thrive in a world where a disease was killing our community. And Tony Kushner imagined a world where we could survive and thrive, where Roy Cohn is the one who dies from that deadly disease, right? Not Pryor, right? Not Lewis, not Belize. A world that's beyond what is to what it ought to be. And there's no way. That's how I met Tony Kushner. I wrote to him and thanked him for saving my life. So theater can do that. The ART is doing that.
Yeah,
other places are. That's part of it. Yep, here.
Paul Gilbert, and I'm going to have more of an historical question rather than theoretical.
Okay.
was this the first formal Declaration of Independence in the world? And if it was not, was it a template for what we refer to as our founding fathers and mothers?
Yes, first Declaration of Independence that was written and circulated. In fact, the Declaration of the Rights of Men in France, they were influenced by the Declaration of Independence. And then it then begins to snowball following that. Haiti, which is the world's first black republic, their Declaration of Independence is modeled very closely after the American Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, so it sets in motion an acceleration, but it's the first example of a written document, Declaration of Independence, that leads to the separation of and the dissolving of those political bands. And then it accelerates after that.
Just a quick follow-up, so that there was not in Western Europe, which had many different subsets, not necessarily countries, that have done their battles for centuries. No formal declaration.
That's correct, in part because at the time, so one of the things that Jefferson, the Founding Fathers, and the early Americans, and it actually goes through the 19th century, they felt besieged by the fact that first, the long tradition of culture and politics and art in Europe was overwhelming for Americans, and most Europeans had concluded, because of the way in which history was taught, that democracies were a stupid form of government. Because democracies are unstable, they don't last. Look at the example of Greece and Rome. And in fact, the most popular book in the classical antiquity is The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, in which it's abysmal what happens. And so Europeans laughed at Americans. It's like, why are you creating this new democracy? It's not going to last.
Yeah.
And so that was another reason. And then, in fact, it would seem to be confirmed after the revolutions of 1848 in Europe. And many of the revolutionaries in 1848 modeled their short-lived revolutions and their declarations on the American Revolution. But most of them were shut down, were overwhelmed by force. And it really wasn't until, honestly, it wasn't until after World War II that Americans overcame their insecurities about their political system and their artistic system and their literary system. And one example of that is in 1949, in English departments at Harvard and elsewhere, of all published literary criticism in English departments in the United States, there was less than 10% that had anything to do with American literature.
Yeah.
Because people thought, American literature, it's not literature. It's just not that good. If you really want high literature, you go to England.
But when we started teaching protest literature, there was no course at Harvard in which Steinbeck was read.
Yeah, none.
When we first started teaching this 20 years ago.
I looked it up. He hadn't been taught at Harvard.
We decided we were going to, we were trying to figure out, because we realized that we could get away with assigning two big novels, one from the 19th century, one from the 20th century, in a course on American protest literature. So we knew Uncle Tom's Cabin was going to be the 19th century novel. And we were debating between The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison and John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. It came down to those two. And we found out that Invisible Man was being taught in like 7 different classes, and no one was teaching Steinbeck. So we added Steinbeck rather than Ellison to, we give some of Ellison's essays in the course, but not The Invisible Man. And so when we started teaching protest literature, they laughed at us. We were freshly, newly minted PhDs. We were young folks, and we thought we knew everything. We did know everything. Yeah. And now we know more. But when we were starting to do, there were folks in this English department, I dare say, who were like, protest literature, right? What's that about? In an English department? Because we started in the English department and then went to the core or gen ed curriculum, which is where we've taught it ever since, right? But there was even a hostility to this, right? This course, because we were expanding the definition of literature, we were focusing on dissent, which was propaganda. We got a lot of pushback on this course when it first started.
And it wasn't just Harvard. I arrived at Harvard in 1999 as an assistant professor, and not just Harvard, but at Yale, where I got my PhD, at Columbia, Princeton. If you looked at all of the texts that was taught, less than 20% focus on American literature.
Yeah.
This is in 1999.
Yeah, right, exactly. In English departments.
In
They
English
were
departments.
teaching them in African American studies
Right,
departments
right.
and women and gender studies and so forth. But one last point about your question, remember that the late 18th century was a time where the nation state as such, right, as a construction, as an imagining, was really very new in world history. That this was a period where empires were still the sort of currency of people imagining a kind of relationship with themselves, right? And empires that were built on slavery and the slave trade and the dispossession of indigenous people and so forth. So the nation state, right, this is the first written Declaration of Independence to bring for a nation to write itself into existence, but the idea of a nation state and the rise of nationalism was really just beginning to be a historical phenomenon at this moment, but as we said, it then accelerates. And one of the things about the Declaration of Independence that's interesting and sort of telling is that it sets in motion both a kind of a desire for sovereign nationalism of nation states that are independent from one another, free and equal station, and it sets in motion a kind of global radical tradition, right, that in many ways is used to speak truth to power against those very states. And so the Declaration of Independence is something that inspires the enslaved natives of Haiti, what becomes Haiti, and also inspires the founding documents of their own nation state. Same thing in France, right? Same thing in so many different places, and the ways in which in Vietnam, right, our enemy, the enemy of America, were invoking the Declaration of Independence in the resistance movements to our imperial project in the 1960s and 1970s, right? And then invoke the Declaration of Independence once that war ends. And so the Declaration of Independence shows up in so many ways. The Danish resistance to Nazism, a resistance to apartheid in South Africa, right? There are all these ways in which this has a life that carries on long into the future. We have a couple, maybe 2 or 3 more questions. Here we go. Here.
I want to go back to the Constitution itself.
Yeah.
Some kind of technical questions here. When you said that it wasn't finalized until August, it made me wonder, if you go over to the old State House, they'll tell you that on July 18th, they read the Declaration of Independence from the balcony. Mm-hmm. And presumably they sent them all the other colonies as well. Mm-hmm. What did they read?
Well,
and how many versions are out there?
Oh, there's lots of versions. I mean, they probably read the text of the Declaration, which was in circulation. It had not yet been signed by everyone yet. Right? It had been voted on by 12 of the 13 colonies. It had become, in essence, the law of the land, whatever that meant at the time. And that was, I'm sure, I don't know, I haven't been over there in a long time, but I'm sure that it was that version of the revision of Jefferson's draft that was voted on by the Second Continental Congress, which was certainly in circulation and known to people at the time. It just wasn't yet official in the way that the Trumbull painting makes it seem like it was official.
That's right. Yeah. And part of the delay was it was for political and military reasons and wanting to make sure that the colonies were truly all united. The last thing they wanted to do was to start circulating it too early before they had...
With all the names on it.
Yeah.
Right? Because, I mean, these are all people who have committed treason in the eyes of the British, right? Yeah. And so the part of it also was a practical concern about military readiness. Yeah. And willingness to be able to win this fight because ultimately it's going to require a military conflict as well, which had already begun before the Declaration was signed. Any other? Yeah. Do we share the reading list of the course? Oh, sure. Yeah. We could do that somehow. Yeah. I mean, we could actually post it. Diane, can we do this? Can we post it on the ART website or something? We'll figure out a way. Oh, yeah, that's right. You have everybody's emails. Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's very easy.
That's easy. We can send you this. We can forward you the syllabus and the most recent syllabus. Sure, happy to do that. And as we said, we're working on a book to turn our course into a book because we've been doing it.
If we do that, we can't teach it anymore.
We can't teach it anymore. So this may be it for our teaching, but we're working on this book. So any other? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, you want to start or you want?
Yeah, that's a great question. We talk a lot about the what protest works of literature don't work. So one is we contextualize the work of literature within the movement itself. And so whether the abolition movement is a very effective organizational structure. Women's rights movement is not as effective, but in the largest sense, one of the ways that protest becomes, pardon me?
You mean the early period?
Yes, the early period. One of in fact, right now, I would argue that, in fact, I have argued that the Me Too movement, the current women's rights or feminism, is one. It has been very effective at consciousness raising. But the relationship between the literature and the movement is important. And in general, we point out that the works of protest, the more radical they are, the less likely they're going to be implemented. And that doesn't mean that radicalism is not effective, because the truly radical text, whether it's David Walker's Appeal or whether it's in poetry, Walt Whitman's, and in his brilliantly democratic, egalitarian vision, also in terms of gender, or David or Nat Turner, his As Told to Confessions, that they inspire other activists, and that the time lag between when that document is circulated and when there's finally transformation can take much longer, but it can be ultimately more effective. Whereas one of the things we highlight with Uncle Tom's Cabin is that part of the reason why it's the best-selling novel in the 19th century is her timing was perfect. And she never defined herself as an abolitionist.
She hated going to meetings.
She said she was anti-slavery, and there's a huge difference. Most opponents of slavery were anti-slavery, meaning that they hated slavery, but they wanted it ended gradually over a long period of time. Lincoln, who's anti-slavery, said that he didn't envision the end of slavery for not less than 100 years. He says this in 1858 in his debates with Stephen Douglas. So as an anti-slavery advocate, Lincoln hated slavery, but the earliest he could see it ending is 1958.
Yeah.
Abolitionists, that's true.
He wasn't
that's
wrong.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Abolitionists insisted upon an immediate end to slavery and racial equality.
You're right.
And Stowe was not that. And so part of the power of her book now is the broad anti-slavery appeal. To her credit, she does highlight these blacks who have, in a sense, waged war, rhetorical war, become middle-class, successful citizens in Cincinnati. And she gives a laundry list of their net worth, their occupation. So there's a very small sense of an abolitionist rhetoric, but most of the book is anti-slavery. And that has a huge impact on the power of that text.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we highlighted a number of things in the course. One is we every year our reading of Uncle Tom's Cabin changes. Uncle Tom's Cabin is another one of those works. Like, I've read Uncle Tom's Cabin 10 times, and 5 times I hate it, 4 times I love it, 1 time I'm like, oh, okay, she was onto something. Right? And it changes over time depending on where I am at any given moment. And the class too, right? When the Black Lives Matter movement emerged in full force after the summer of Ferguson, right, and Michael Brown's murder, students that fall were not having any of Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? They weren't interested in Uncle Tom's Cabin at all. They wanted to know what David Walker was saying, right? And other folks were saying. So, the appetite for this in the class changes over time. And one of the things that we show in Uncle Tom's Cabin is that it was radical in so many ways, and yet at the same time it was very conservative in others. It was a text that itself was full of contradictions, and it's one of the things that we try to tease out in the course. But the fact of the matter is that David Walker's Appeal is not a text that any of them have read until they come and take this course, usually, right? Except for if they have, Howard Zinn acolyte who taught them AP American history. But they've all read Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? And Uncle Tom's Cabin is more canonical than David Walker's Appeal. So even within the abolitionist movement, you have these two texts that we teach in sequence in the class that are relatively more radical or more conservative, and one was much more impactful and much more well-known and has been much more remembered and centered in literary studies and studies of social movements and so forth than the other. And the other thing too, although the course is a course that focuses mainly on sort of left-leaning protest literature. We tried one year to do this sort of balanced thing. It ended up being like weird for both of us, and then we were trying to do too much, and it didn't quite work. And then we realized that, like, you know, there have been a lot of courses at Harvard that taught the other side of this over the years, so we were going to do something different. But we talk a lot about the successes and the failures and what accounts for that. We talk a lot about what success means and what the metrics of success are. Is the metric of success an electoral victory? Is the measure of success a law passed in a legislature? Is the metric of success revolution? Is the metric of success the rights of citizenship for a group that's been denied that? And so we talk about the different ways in which different eras, different periods, different contexts, different movements raise up their own metrics, their own ways of understanding this. And we also talk about the need for these cultural workers, who all these people are, to do a radical imagining about what the country could be if it were to live up to its ideals, as opposed to a more practical or pragmatic way of thinking about success as incremental or reform-minded. But we talk about all of those things in the class. But the one thing that I love, and John and I always love this. The final assignment for the course is an optional assignment. They can either write a more traditional analytical paper where they take a text or two in the course and they do some outside research and write something that's more in the line of an expository analytical essay. And then we give them the option to do a creative assignment. And every year about at least half the students choose to do the creative assignment. The creative assignment is to create their own protest literature and then write a critique of it. So to become these protest cultural workers and then to bring a critical lens based on the themes of the course to that work. And we've had some absolutely exceptional works. One of my favorites was we had a student who was trained at Juilliard and also studied at Harvard, who was a concert cellist, had played at Carnegie Hall and Lincoln Center. And she did a mashup performance and recording where she took patriotic hymns and mashed them up with slave spirituals and jazz and the blues. And she performed the mashup. She wrote her own songs and then performed them. Right? There's an African-American woman cellist, right? Played at Carnegie Hall. And she performed this in the yard. And then we had another student who was a painter who did this huge canvas where she reimagined the Last Supper as an interracial gay wedding, which I actually have. She gave it to me as a gift, which I have at home. My husband is like, what the fuck is this? He's like, this is not sexy. We can't have this in the bedroom. And so we have it. It's there. But he's like, I don't need your students' artwork on our walls. But we have all these things. We've had sculptures and daguerreotypes. Students have done all of this stuff. We had one once where a student wrote a prison letter about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in blood, and we think fecal matter, that he left without any hazmat warning in one of our mailboxes in the Barker Center. Yeah. So we had to place some constraints on the next year, although it does give us a good story to tell. But we've had all this. The students have recorded rap albums, documentary films. We've had all sorts of things that have come out of this. Social media campaigns, protests, acts of civil disobedience, which they've used the class to organize and write manifestos for. And we have an open house at the end, a kind of salon like this where the students come together at the end of the term. An exhibition. And John and I come and they just perform and they share stuff and we get a bunch of pizza. And it's a wonderful way to end the term, because one of the things that John and I wanted to do in this class is not just to kind of chronicle and catalog the long history of protest literature and radical traditions in terms of our history, culture, and politics, but to try as best we could to use our teaching and our own passion for the work that we do in the world and in the classroom and on the page, to produce some kind of spark in the next generation. And ultimately that's what it does. It's, we've taught this course for the greater part of 2 decades, and we've been from 9/11 to Donald Trump. And we've seen it all transpire in our class. We had students walk out for dining hall workers strike. We have students do die-ins for Black Lives Matter campaigns. John and I organized a teach-in in advance of the Iraq War. We walked out of class the day before shock and awe. We've been through the Trump election and the Obama election and the Bush election in this course, and we've had to teach in the midst of the sea changes that have taken place in the nation and the world over the course of the 20th, 21st century. And our students have responded to that intellectually, politically, culturally, and creatively, and it's been a real gift.
And on that note, thank you both so much.